Hello, everybody. Welcome to Over the Mountains. Today, I am with Liam Kavanagh, the co-founder of Life Itself and co-director of CMP. I'm Sylvie Barbier, and today we'll be talking about basically the evolution of religion and what is the role of religion and the place of religion into a second Renaissance future. And so I'll be interviewing Liam for that. Um, Liam, I guess I think one thing that uh, I'd love maybe to start with like asking you a little bit, what's your relationship to religion and particularly to Christian religion?
Yeah, yeah, it's a little bit of a switch from the climate majority project every day, but it's really important, right? So, and we all have a personal relationship to religion. I think mine started as a young person, very young person, with my father. We were seated at a bar. My 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 father, like many good Irish, fathers are kind of would take me to the pub sometimes, and he was talking about God for some reason. I had this question of like, why do people believe in God? I asked him, and then he said, well, if there's no God, where'd everything come from? Um, you know, where'd the trees come from? The 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 earth, etc. And then I said, well, where did God come from? And he said, well, he was always there. And then I asked him, well, if God could always be there, why couldn't just like the universe always be there or the earth? Um, and I probably said it in a different tone of voice than that when I think I was 5 years old at this point. And he had this reaction like, oh my God, this kid's, kind of he was found it hilarious and then showed me to some friend of his. This kid doesn't believe in God. Look at that. And then then the kid, the friend came over to argue, and it was exactly the same argument. Where I was like, well, why do people believe in God? And he had the same thing. Where did everything come from? And I had the same answer, and they had no answer. And I think that was probably part of my relationship, with the start of my relationship with religion, or and a kind of fraught one. I think what unconsciously came through in that interaction was my father was at one point a member of the Catholic, well, clergy in training, was the brothers at that point. And he left after they would not let him out to see his own father on his deathbed, but they would let him out for the funeral. So the Catholics are
Mm.
very famous for their emphasis on ritual. And I think, sometimes there was one incident when my brother and I were ill, and we had to stay home from church, and our father was like, he never went to church, right? So he never went to church, and when we stayed home, uh, he said, "Well, no, it's all right. We can have church." We're like, "Can you do things?" Like, "Oh yeah, sure." I, I was trained, and then he like broke up bread and made a little altar, and took a prayer pillow and kind of said some things out of and gave it to us. We drank a bit of grape juice, and he's like, "There." It took like 10 minutes, but yeah, we had a mass.
Mm.
He was very irreverent, and I think he was kind of like also bringing that into us, because I think we found out later he really had lost his faith in a lot of ways, but also I think that story, um, he was also like teaching me what negative numbers. He was a math teacher, so he was teaching me what negative numbers were at a young age and things like that. And there may have been this kind of like conflict between logic and religion in that story
Mm.
already, which I think is, really at the heart of what our own alienation from our tradition, wisdom tradition.
Yes, is there, what I hear is that there in way. Also, with modernity, we came to see a little bit the incoherences of our religion, our ancestral lineage religion. Um, And you were also talking once we were having this conversation, and we can sense that there's a big kind of like wave of movement around going back to religion at the moment, like going back to Christianity. I think there's something very beautiful about wanting to reconnect with the spiritual realm, but there's also some dimension that I know I at times can feel a little bit uncomfortable because it's like also in this going back, losing the gift of modernity, of losing reason, losing logos. Could you speak a little bit more about that point of like already in your origination story of like the relationship between mythos and logos in a way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's very difficult, right? That's something that people raised in a rationalist culture. It was kind of like one of these kids. If you're one of these kids who gets patted on the head for getting the right answer in a class, right? Because I was kind of good at school type stuff. I found it really boring, so I didn't actually study very much. And I didn't get. I was an enthusiastic student, but I was kind of like talented and got some good grades and whatever, won some awards when I paid attention and things. And my parents were both teachers, so if you get kind of uh, rewarded for getting the right answer and for thinking logically, then that same ability ends up in conflict with Christian mythos and many forms of mythos, right? So, I mean, it's probably worth saying at the start as well that my relationship in adulthood, like things like many people who fit that description, kind of tending towards Buddhism because the mythos of Buddhism is not particularly difficult to integrate into the rationalist viewpoint. You can kind of like it's quite noticeable that we can argue about whether science proves non-self, but what it doesn't do is totally contradict it, right? And
Mm.
that's a different thing, which I think a lot of discussion uh, misses. So
Can you? I'm not sure I understand. It's true that for my exam, it's true that for me, when I discovered Buddhism, it felt very good for my logos because it just felt very coherent. Um, there was not that sense of like cognitive dissonance
yeah,
between the logic. Its logic felt very uh, uh, coherent. Whereas it's true that in the Christian myth, there was a lot of moments where I was like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Like how I think like a small example about uh, needing to be baptized, that only like if you're all children of God, then well, God surely would want to and love us all, then why would only certain ones access to paradise versus others? That sense of like there's certain things that didn't feel right in my heart as a child. Um, uh, and you're and I guess why I'm pointing to that, you were just saying, uh, could you give me maybe an example? Like, I guess you gave your example about the questioning of the existence of God, that he's always been there. Can you kind of really reflect, give a more example also for you of like where there's a moment of like, that doesn't make sense, um, for you in terms of Christianity, but also maybe as an adult, like there's like the that first intuition as a child, and then there's like, wait a second, that still doesn't make sense as an adult.
oh well, I mean, I could say my brother and I both kind of dismissed Christianity as like Santa Claus for adults, and I think we were 7 years old. I remember, or maybe I was like walking around. I was seven, he was nine, maybe. So we were young. I forget what it was. But I remember this conversation where we came to this conclusion after it was revealed that, as we'd suspected, that there was no Santa Claus. We then decided that the adults had their own Santa Claus, whose name was God, uh, and
Hmm.
so we stopped believing. So, and I think it was. I didn't have a lot of I, more like seeing the truth in Christian God has been a slow thing in adulthood, and coming to the conclusion that this like purely rationalist viewpoint wasn't the truth was probably been mostly my journey in adulthood. You know, and then of course, even we should probably mark that even in Buddhism there are some things like reincarnation, right? So some viewers may be saying that to themselves, like, what about reincarnation? True, it doesn't particularly, it's not particularly scientific, but there are bits of Buddhism, like the one that we all have a relationship with Plum Village. They don't believe in reincarnation. That segment of Buddhism has not
Hmm.
entertained reincarnation very seriously for quite a long time. I don't know how many years, but it's centuries, and it's clearly not integral in the way that there's not a lot of Christian sects who don't believe in everlasting life and that Jesus made miracles and that the whole rest of it, right? So
I guess also maybe one particular dimension of I feel that the Bible speaks actually a lot in metaphors. Um, and I think in my path, I also had like a strong rejection of Christianity for a long time. And as you know, Catalina, my mom, she's a fervent Christian, but her relationship to, I actually find her relationship to Christianity and God very healthy.
mm,
Um, and she's actually one person who would say to me, I think we should edit the Bible. Some parts of it are homophobic. And, you know, it touches this question about what is a sacred text, how do you evolve religion that are like my mom, as being a fervent Christian, can also still recognize that there's something dysfunctional within that frame. Um, and I guess y I'm also interested in what you, in one conversation you were having, you were talking about, okay, well, in the West, we're quite rooted. We have this religious root system of Christianity. It's the religion, it's our ancestral religion. It's hard for us to really become Buddhist because that's not our ancestral religion. So how would we evolve our relationship to Christianity? It's not maybe the most logical, best one, but it's the one we've got. And can you say a little bit more about that, how you would sense like a possible healthy evolution to Christianity, to the Christian myths?
yeah, well, I mean it's a great question. I would go, yeah, with your story, right? So about your mother, right? This kind of editing the Bible. It's your mother. So for people who don't know, Sylvie's mother is a person with a very natural mystical connection. She once revealed that she'd taken a tab of LSD and didn't notice the difference. Didn't work because basically, Catalina's there already. Um,
Yeah.
you know, there's this kind of sense that okay, one of the mythical. We asked before about mythical conflicts between myth and reason, right? So if there's one which is really hard in Christianity, it's probably the idea that like everything is true. The Bible is true. This all happened, right? Like there's this kind of idea that you're supposed to believe it, and at the same time, it's really kind of clear if you apply the same methods of textual analysis that you just apply to any other book, the evolution of any other story to the Bible, that it was edited in the past, right? They may not have called it editing, but whatever happened, my story would probably be at a certain point, someone had the Gospel of John revealed to them by God. The Gospel of John arrives on the scene quite late, more than 100 years after Christ dies. Scholars think it's sort of clear that it inherits specific phrases from the other Gospels, and it's very different, right? That like Jesus Christ in the early Gospels, for example, Mark has a lot to say about apocalypse, and there's a very advanced tradition of Jewish apocalyptical preaching at the time. And that kind of goes away in John, and he starts, it's more of the good news. And that's the one that's really popular, right? And so Christianity shifts like quite massively. And so people could read about this. And um, there's a book called Jesus Christ, Jewish Apocalyptic Preacher by, I think his name is Bart Ehrlichman. Uh, we can put the link in. But and then there's another one which is how I think it's how Jesus became God by the same author, right? And if you look at that history and you read the Bible, it's incredibly clear what kind of this evolution. And so it's happened in the past, and then the question is why can't it happen again? And my feeling is that recently is that well, we have this what's called a God-shaped hole, lack of connection to like mystery, um, the place where the Gospel of John would have come from, right? The person probably didn't actually sit down and be like, what do we need to make a better religion, you know? And kind of like where you hear this, like, and that may have happened at other points, right? But it may also be that they kind of had this thing come to them as sort of like a poet comes to them. The language of John is incredibly poetic. It's hard to believe that it was kind of created as a bit of propaganda for me personally. I personally would think it came from as a through a poetic revelation from what a person experiences God, and I wouldn't even we could get into it. I wouldn't necessarily dispute that phrase because like I think that's part of your inheritance as a member of Christianity is this ability to have conversations with something which is larger than you, which we call God, which is, maybe a metaphor for creation or the creator, but is as true a metaphor as maybe anything else that we're capable of, right? And somebody may have had a conversation with that creator and they may have been told that the Gospel of John was the correct, or not the
Mm.
correct, but a deeper truth than what had been practiced up to that point, right? But it's clear that happened, right? And so your mother's,
So yes, what you're trying to point to is that, oh, Christianity had like some renewal, rebirth at times. And so new texts appeared. And if that historically, if you look like that Christianity were able to have those kind of moments of renewal, then why can't it have another renewal again? Is that in a way what you're pointing towards in terms of like the Gospel of John?
well, I mean, well, so yes, and it's probably a question. Why can't it? Why are we having such a hard time renewing it? I don't think that this is a culture like if you think about it, right? There's cultures of people for thousands of years where like new religious divine poetry or new almost scriptures like the suttas, etc., are kind of written all the time. Now, if you
Mm,
think of like spiritual poetry, right? Kind of the genre of like long lyrical poetry, like the Tao Te Ching is, or and you could put the Gospel of John in that category, but that category of of writing, there's not really a lot of examples of it in recent centuries from
mm.
the West, which makes it historically unique.
Difficult to help it emerge again because it's
Right.
not in our conception something like well, maybe we lost the practice or so. Uh, like when you say that, I'm like, well, it's probably because also that sense of like, oh, this is the truth, this is it, and so then it also for like it creates a difficulty to have new children. If like this is the end game, if the Bible as it is, or those sacred texts are the end game, then it cuts a bit of a creativity to kind of make, other offerings.
Exactly, it's the literal truth, right? And because the literal truth is not satisfying, the connection to the mystery that is the root of renewal, that is the root of new poetry, new myth, right? Is cut, right? So
Mm.
there's this thing, what I call a double bind in Christian culture, where in order to reinvent, for a God to come into the God-shaped hole, you do need some type of connection to the greater. But the specific form of our spiritual blockage actually prevents that, right? So,
Mm.
or makes it very difficult, right? So we people don't want to come up with new interpretations of uh, religious texts. When you propose that, radical ones, you propose that, it just sounds like megalomaniacal, or something like that. And the reality is, like, well, people did this all the time. You know, that's where Christianity came from. That's where renewal in Buddhism often comes from. A lot of the new schools have like these elaborate suttas which nobody reads.
Yeah, and I guess in Christianity there has been also like one is also in the beginning of Christianity, my understanding there was a lot more sects. There's been like selection of texts, but also within later on in Christian history, like Protestantism is a form of renewal.
Mhm.
Like, the appearance of Quakerism was like wanting to reconnect. So there has been, uh, mm, like, I think there's often many cycles in life where there's a birth, there's a calcification, and then in the calcification there's a outshoot of a new birth still within that lineage. Could you say a little bit more also to the ori like because Christianity's ancestral root is actually Judaism, and
Mm.
you were talking about how the in that book you said like, oh, Jesus had a lot of like apocalyptic texts or messaging, and how that relates. Yeah, you made a point about like the in a way, Judaism might have also experienced a moment of like hitting a bit of a dead end and
Right.
also needing to find a way to renew itself. Because I think it's really interesting to look at, our like the Western ancestor lineage of religion, of how it had been able to renew or not, and
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
what are to give us. And in looking for me, I guess I'm interested in that because it gives us the permission to do that again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? So, yeah, looking back at where did Christianity come from, we're at this time of civilizational crisis. And well, it came from a civilizational crisis, right? Like, uh, Jewish civilization was at a crossroads. So, basically, the Romans had been dominating Judea for a very long time. Um, Anybody can look this up. You can have a chat with ChatGPT nowadays to verify this if you want. It will tell you that this is basically correct. The Jews felt that this domination of by the Romans was a sign of divine disfavor because they had a myth that they were the chosen people of God, and God had promised them a kingdom that lasted for a very long time. I forget the exact time period, but it was a long time, and um, there was always supposed to be a Jewish king, and yet the Romans just kept on sticking around as the conquerors of Judea. There'd been several rebellions; they'd been put down. The Roman Empire just stuck around and stuck around and stuck around, and that is the environment into which Jesus Christ was born, where this apocalyptic tradition had started, uh, largely about the from the thought that, well, this was against the will of God, and so some reckoning had to happen, and that God might come to earth and save the Jews from Roman domination, but only possibly if the Jews behaved very well or were very much in his favor. So one way of reading what Jesus was doing, or where the intuition comes from, is that you have to be, if we treat each other in the way that God would really want his children to treat each other, and this, living this, beautiful, giving life, then we would have God's favor. And this is someone like Albert Schweitzer, the famous humanitarian, believed this. This was something that, when he read the Bible as a young man, he came to very similar conclusions. And of course, there are phrases in the Bible that say things like, before who are living are now dead, my Father will come, and it's kind of clear language about divine return to earth and judgment, right? So, of course, that doesn't happen, right? And what does happen is that the Jews generally have a rebellion against the Romans not very long after Jesus dies. And that's the end of ancient Judea. After that, the Romans crush ancient Judea. And what's called the Second Temple of Israel, the Second Temple period, then ends after a Roman onslaught. And not all the Jews die, but their myth is crushed, right? So what's called Second Temple Judaism, which was started by people who had come back from Babylon. So there was a Jewish elite that was exiled to Babylon after a previous invasion. When they came back, these prophecies about the long-lasting Jewish kingdom came with them, and that period of mythical integrity was broken by the Roman put down of the Jewish rebellion. And so then what do you do, right? What you do is you have this really powerful myth, you're the chosen people of God. There is one true God. You have his favor. It's your whole life is based around it. Your people's whole life is based around it. Do you throw it out, or do you find a way to save it? So there's two ways that people saved it. One is sort of the evolution of the modern rabbinical Judaism, which involves in reinterpretation of the old texts, but increasingly scholarly. What is really meant? What wisdom can we really find this? And very intricate reinterpretation, which you sometimes find in Abrahamic religions, and where we looked at what are we really saying? What's the real truth in here? And it's certainly not literalist, and we find it gets farther and farther away from being literal. And then another version of that is Christianity. So Jesus was a Jewish man, and basically he was saying that in this time he was talking about the return of God and how the Jews were going to be kind of saved by God quite soon if they really deserved it, basically. And he was saying, also prophesying that they would deserve it, basically. And then, but the Gospel of John, as we mentioned before, right, that story changes what he was really saying 100 years afterwards, right? And this is a lot more plausible in times when they don't have written records and there's relatively few, few surviving records and lots of oral records. We know oral traditions change much quicker. What he was really saying is that God is promising everlasting life, that the true kingdom is within, and that God is is offering us everlasting life, and that's the new covenant. So forget about these, this earthly, this earthly kingdom, right? It's not that's not God's kingdom. Uh,
Hmm.
and if we accept that, then we're the true people of God. And if you reinterpret his message that way, then wow, that's a new myth, right? Which is very welcome to a people whose mythical reality has been shattered.
Hmm.
And so then you have, if you want to make a myth which is so fantastical in a way, right? Like there's the Son of God was sent to earth, he died on a cross, uh, and he came to redeem our sins, and if we follow him, we get everlasting life. It's very attractive if you believe in it. The trouble is believing in it. But if you've got a huge group of people who's just ready to believe in it, because it helps them save their whole mythical, cultural, civilizational reality, then you have a good early group of people. So when you're around those people, that reality is going to be incredibly strong.
Hmm.
And from a scientific standpoint, from a rationalist standpoint, it's kind of hard to avoid the conclusion that's what happened.
Hmm.
And then there's this question of like, there's still mythical reality is a human gift and necessity at the same time. So how do you put that into a myth, right? A new myth.
Yes, because we are maybe in a different way, but also in a civilizational crisis right now with our mythology of also with the mythology of Christianity, like that you and I have just mentioned, is like a lot of people had run away from Christianity because of its gap between the logic, the rational, and the myth. At the same time, it has left a big vacuum, a spiritual vacuum, a heart vacuum, and some people there's not yet. I think there is a lot of people who touch spirituality, who are experimenting with that, who are not looking to go back to Christianity. But there are a group of people who want, because we have such a strong root system of Christianity that has been our ancestral religion, who are going back to Christianity. But how do you? That's why I think the religion of the future, there's maybe completely new religion that we have no idea what shape, form they will fully have. There's also possibly reinterpretation or going back. It's like I think in gardening, you take a tree, you cut a greffe in French. You take a rose tree, then you put an apple seed, and it becomes an apple tree. But how do you say hybrid? In
Graft.
grafting. So there's this very powerful root system of Christianity, and what form of maybe grafting or what form of like reinterpretation. What I found very fascinating with my mom is like, oh, well, my mom has a very maybe almost rabbinistic relationship to the Bible, which is looking at it as uh, looking at it as the metaphor and access to the mystical dimension versus completely fully like this is word for word the truth. I feel that's one way of approaching old like ancient religion, uh, and there would be yeah, I think yes, I think that's so important because with the crisis we're facing, religion will play a role in it. And
Mm.
there's a sense of because the crisis we're facing need us to take huge collective action, and the thing that helps us move into big collective action is religion, is to have a sense of something bigger than ourselves that we belong to. Uh, and some of the greatest activists have been touched by the mystical and the religious. And so it is really important to actually grapple our head around that dimension. I think religion has a huge positive role possibly to play in facing the climate crisis, in facing also the technological crisis, because in a way AI has become God,
Mm.
to technology has become God, has replaced God. So we are human being are religious animal, mythical animal. We always believe in certain ideas, ideology, and that becomes the water we swim in. So it is important to be conscious of that and sense, okay, what um how do we, knowing that, as you say, that necessity, this is a curse and a blessing, how do we move forward? I'd love to hear a little bit, yeah, any more you'd like to say, because I think um, why I value this our friendship so much and this conversation so much is that I think you're a very rare person who has the ability to speak to it, and also have the historical context, that you can bridge the science and the mystical and the historical all together. It's very hard to actually bridge all these things together, to link those dots together. Some, like my mom, for example, is more into the mystical dimension, but might have some historical, but not so much, but doesn't have the science. Some
Mm,
people have the science but don't have the mystical. And it's like, I think there's really that value of integrating those different dimensions that will help us find a path through the mountain. Because
mm,
in over the mountain is like, hey, there's this place where that we feel is possible, but we can't take shortcut. And therefore we have to look really hard as how have we end up in this crisis and how can we move forward?
yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I mean, your connection to, so what, we could talk about, like, if we switch back to Buddhism for a bit, right? So, like, the Buddhists have this idea of, and Christians have something similar, right? That the truth of, of Jesus's truths are written on our heart, right? The laws that he taught or written in our heart has been returned to by many Christian theologians, right? He was in many ways clearly preaching for good things, right? And those things are quite similar to what a lot of other wisdom traditions, the Buddhists, for example, um, teach as would teach morally, and so we have a connection to that, which is innate, is thought, right? And which I agree with, that it's possible to. There's an innate moral sense of what is good, which we can rely on, and but that sense is something we cultivate, right? It has to be cultivated, and the containers within which we cultivate that sense of spiritual truth are our religions, right? So Christianity was, for better or worse, in our past, a way of getting closer to God, we can say, right? And this is something I think probably have to get, you know, go deep here, right? So, you know, like I don't have a, I do, have conversations with God sometimes, and I think when we say, and many people do, if you look at polls, I forget what percentage of it. It's not. I'm not in a tiny minority in any Western society. Obviously, in a majority in America, right? But not a minority anywhere, right? Not a small minority anywhere. But
Mhm.
the point is that there's kind of like, you feel sometimes that different feeling tones, we'd say, in Buddhism, like these kind of like innate, you can sometimes feel whether you're believing something because it's true or you would like it to be true. What is the source of the kind of words that might be going through your mind, right? When you're hearing, when you feel yourself, a voice is coming into your head, but what's the connection that is its genesis? And sometimes, I feel like it's my ego sneaking in there. And sometimes I feel like there's another feeling where I feel like, oh, this is from some other source of guidance. And that for me, the feeling is very close to the poetic feeling, very close to a certain, the feeling that you have when something just tells you you should do something, right? And so, and I think that there's kind of this issue in any religion, or when anybody speaks from looking inwards, that you have those two influences, that the ego sneaks in there, right? So we're both cultivating that connection at the same time. The ego can always sneak into our conversations with God and pose as God, right? Like
Yes.
that's
I I'd love to speak more to that. Like, one I also I feel I picked more recently more on praying, and there was such a resistance at first. Uh, but I got that this is a language that I've grew up with because of my mother, and I really rediscovered the power of prayer. Um, And so I'm particularly interested, I have an interest of wanting to, find a healthy way to Christianity because it is, I have a Buddhist ancestral lineage spiritually, but also a Christian one, and I want to heal that. Um, and yet at the same time, I know in my quest around looking at religion, spirituality, there's sometimes this desire to have a perfect form, a safeguard against the ego. Okay, and I had also many conversation with you, with Rufus, with Paplin, and often I see that Westerners, even when we're talking about other things such as guilds there's this desire for perfect form,
mm,
like oh, like, and I think it comes from a quite Christian Western ideology of like this is the truth, this is final, like there will be a perfect form as like the book of the Bible, and that's it.
mm,
And whereas, like, actually, life is ever moving, ever uncertain and changing. So there is no perfect form. There can be safeguards against the ego of, like, for example, the idea of service or nonviolence. There's certain principle that can base it, but there is no perfect form. And if we can surrender that there is no perfect form, it also allows for evolution. It also allows for future generation to take what we've built and move it, morph it, mutate it into what will be appropriate for their time. And I
mm,
think there's something in the West, I think in the desire for control and for because the perfect form comes from that desire for certainty and control. And like embracing that there is no perfect form, there is there is more or less correct for right now, and there I think there's principle that can safeguard, but there is no, yes, there is no certainty that what will, yes, there's this, I don't know, for me it's also very relevant to this kind of renewal of our approach to religion and spirituality, to also not try to do something uh, perfect, because I think then it makes it ever more dangerous for corrupt calcification.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's you've hit on it there, right? That's what has driven the calcification, as you say, of the tradition, right? So, like when we looked at um, modernism, right? So, like modernists as an artistic movement, uh, a lot of them felt like, oh, we were in a new stage of history. We need a new culture. So, for me, some of the most interesting people still are the people in the 1950s who realized, oh, we're in a new technological age. The people like Harry Partch and Sam Beckett were the last, like the high modernists, where they didn't lose the confidence. Like the postmodernism has this. There's a lot of people in the around the time of Derrida where we start deconstructing, whereas there was reconstructing. There was an interesting, tendency to try to reconstruct, to retell myths, to revive, to some type of renewal. You can sense a much more mystical quality and confident quality in the works of, say, Beckett or Harry Partch, Kandinsky, and that's kind of there's a long generation where that's lost. I think what we're pointing to here is that we need permission to be spiritually creative, right? And so there's this thing like, some people would probably listen to this and like, oh, they want to create a new religion, like because this idea that like religion is basically, inherently megalomaniacal, inherently, you have to want to be a savior to be religiously creative, right? You know, what I would say is like, look, for every attempt at something like the Gospel of John in the past, there was loads of other probably, you know, people who felt they had a message from God, and we just don't really just don't survive, right? Like
Yes.
there's a lot of bad spiritual poetry out of a garden in which, you know, kind of not very memorable spiritual poetry and spiritual, you know, mythologizing, you know, out of that garden, there are some finest flowers that grow, and history remembers the finest flowers. It doesn't remember everything else, right? So, like, it's possible to think of the Buddha as this incredible individual. Well, he was an incredible individual because he was part of an incredible time in history, right? Like, there was a very strong tradition in India of people dropping everything and spending their whole lives in single-minded pursuit of sort of spiritual union with the discipline of Olympic athletes, right? You know, that's the way it was, and he wouldn't have been there without all of that.
Yes, there's always a listening in which those messages arise. You know, is you might have a great message, but if the listening is not there, the seeds can't take pick up. There is moments that are favorable for those great moments of transformation and change. I do feel that we are in a precursor of such a moment where there is a very fertile ground for it's like compost, you know, there's a lot of death that is happening culturally. And also when there is a lot of death, there's a lot of possibility for renewal. And so, you know, it's both a dangerous time and a time full of opportunity. Um, like, I think some of the people would say, like, okay, you know, the finest, you said the finest one survive. Could be the finest one or the most survive competitive or like fit
True.
for survival one. It's a bit of a mix. Was it, you know,
Great point.
I think, by the way, in some of the question, I think that often discussing with you, Rufus Faplin, around religion and Buddhism, what I discovered around Buddhism that made me both so uncomfortable was um, that Buddhism doesn't offer a lot of certainty. It doesn't offer a lot of perfect form. It's like always it comes back to you have to, in a way, think for yourself, analyze yourself, look for yourself. And then sometimes I'm just, fuck, sorry for my better English, but fuck's sake, I just would like a perfect form. Just like tell me what to do, tell me what to think. I don't want to do the thinking. Let me abandon myself and just believe in this like goodness and the truth. And that's something that in a way sometimes I envy and I like Christianity about that because it just allows me to not have to think and to not have to be a adult in a way to just, you know, have a father figure, a truth being given that I can just believe in. And so I'm wanting to speak to that because I do sense that a religion of the future would might probably have the discomfort of like we cannot just blindly maybe believe in it. It will ask us to kind of like not be in a relationship of Santa Claus, but having to be in this discomfort of like, I have to use my sense of discernment. Am I giving into ego? Is my ego creeping in? And that's, or is it really uh, a surrendering to faith?
Mm.
And that's really uncomfortable.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah. You're always in the, yeah. In the end, we're all alone, as Krishnamurti, I think, once said. Uh, and there's that certain sense in which no one in that spot, no one can really help you that much. You know, you you can have good teachers, but ultimately, one is on one's own in a certain way. Um, yeah, and that's a hard thing to accept sometimes. Yeah, well, and I think this is it's also remembering that the ancestors have prepared a lot for us. That so the things that you're saying are present in mystical traditions everywhere. There's a lot of mystical traditions within Christianity. So when we look at like the um, kind of mystical orders, right? So people like the Benedictines, for example, are kind of considered to be, particularly unusual in the emphasis placed on a sort of like meditation and this being with God in a very direct way. So there's been a place for that in Christianity. There's just like also this question of the people who have had that type of urged that type of spiritual life, where we're not looking at the book for form, but we're looking within ourselves for truth
Mm,
in our conversations with God. People who had that bearing tended to go to the fringes. Um, and, one part of the reason why I have a lot of admiration for Buddhism is that they oftentimes, the same similar impulses oftentimes cause the person to become like a patriarch um, of a of a Buddhist order. So that this is like there was a capacity to for that type of mindset and people who are very in touch with it to rise, um,
mm.
which is admirable, right? And I think
You're saying that the system of Buddhism allows for mysticism or mystical inclined people to actually be seen and rise compared to maybe other religious system? Is that like that's why I'm understanding when you say that. So I just want to check if that's what you're saying.
I'm not like a worldwide religious scholar, but certainly within compared to Christianity, I would unfortunately say that's probably so.
Mm,
There are very amazing Christian mystics and spiritual teachers, but um, there's not that many of them that like become pope, right?
mm,
And that's quite a big thing, right? So like Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, people probably think he probably would have been the person in charge of Tien, essentially
mm,
like the great teacher of Tien if he'd stayed in Vietnam. Well, he's a renewal. He's a mystic,
mm.
Um, so are many other people.
And I would love to speak to actually Thich Nhat Hanh because he was a mystic, but he was also a very logos person. Like like I think some of the great leaders of religion of the future are able to marry these two dimension. My sense was also when I read the Dalai Lama's text and writing is that there was no he also integrated logos very well. Um, and I think that's one dimension that I felt very touched in Thich Nhat Hanh's is like, there was he didn't throw the baby with the bathwater
Mm,
in terms of science. He found a way to keep like the logos, the rational, and also to keep the mystical, and to have that extraordinary alchemy. Um, that, and I think logos is not our enemy. It's actually, it's the metaphor of the raft. It's there to help us, but there's a point where, I saw in my own spiritual religious journey, I was like, this is helping me, but at some point, I also might need to take a leap of faith and like in faith of beyond the logos, and to
mm,
also not be so scared of that leap of faith. There was a lot of resistance for me to let go of at points of logos in my spirituality because I was so scared of dogmatism, so scared of the violence that had occurred in religion, justified. Um,
mm,
the abandoning logos seems as like that could be used to create a lot of violence. And yeah, I'd love to maybe ask you a question. Is there maybe to kind of finish this first episode, which is our inquiry about, the renewal, a way of like what would be a renewal of Christianity and its roots of like why is it why are we where we are with Christianity, and how could we kind of like find a renewal? What are kind of maybe key dimension that you sense that this renewal will have, like key value or principle or essences?
Yes, that's a hard one. I'll say one thing is prayer, because I feel when people speak to, I sort of like from a personal experiential standpoint, when one speaks to God, there's this sense of contact with truth. Um, and I feel that communication with what we call God is a route to that, uh, potentially. Um, and then there is these kind of ability to, I think the really difficult thing is, what does one do with Jesus? To be really, if we're just going to be really frank about it. And I think this is, part of, I think the renewal, to be perfectly honest with you, I think the biggest thing, in terms of what needs to be done is kind of just having it out, because what's happened is that uh, if you don't believe in the Christian myth as something that actually happened, then basically you aren't really a Christian. And so what people have done, we've got this kind of definition going on. Then you're not, so you're kind of outside of the religion, right? And the kind of idea is, well, because belief is what's important, you don't really count. Now, there's plenty of people who probably don't totally believe in, probably has been that way for a long time or within Christianity, but they're not particularly legitimate within the Christian conversation, right? And there's quite a lot of misgivings. We can go on about them all day long, about everlasting life. What you talked about at the beginning, does that make a lot of sense? Everlasting life, like kind of God is going to use what we did on earth to kind of condemn us for heaven or hell forever. What's so important about what we did in this tiny speck of eternity, that means that we should either, our beloved children should either, his beloved children rather, should go to heaven or hell. It doesn't make that, it doesn't seem like it makes sense, but it does make sense as social control, right? Of getting people to behave on earth. You know, and basically, those types of statements are things that a lot of people will say in private and will not say it in public, because they don't want to offend people who kind of do believe, right? And we're kind of, oh, well, we kind of need to keep it. We don't want to stomp on people's religion. The only problem with it is it's kind of everybody's, like it's everybody's spiritual ancestry, right? And if like the majority of the population have deep misgivings of the kind that we're talking about, and then they're not saying it, then what it leads to is what we've got. Like we can see right in front of us what that leads to. So, part of what I would say is that people should be a lot less polite. And you could take a cue from Jesus there. He wasn't a polite guy. He wasn't a person who, actually said, things that were, he didn't believe, or there was a shrinking violet. And so it's
Mm.
kind of funny to say, to invoke, they have say the Christian religion requires us all to be kind of quiet about it. He had his truth and he spoke it, and I think we believe in debate, we believe in consideration, we believe in inquiry, and this attitude that we can't say things about those voice those deep misgivings publicly about Christianity in a Christian
Mm.
post-Christian civilization is very problematic. There's one thing if like voicing your deep misgivings with some other society's religion to them, because you don't necessarily need to live within it, and you're not necessarily part of like the group,
Problem.
the
Yeah.
religious, right? The people who are bound together. Religion is kind of the things that bind us together, literally, and you're not. It's not. the thing that's binding your group together. But
Mm,
in Western society, Christianity has traditionally been part of it, and whether we like it or not, it's kind of still there. And I find that even people who are children of non-Christian parents or whose ancestors immigrated to these societies have this curiosity about it, right? Like they're not. My interest is they're not disinterested in this conversation because they sense the same stuckness, right? And I think it's that stuckness, voicing these questions and allowing ourselves to be awkward and exploratory.
yeah. I want to maybe speak to a couple of points actually, which for me, one of like an interesting group that's been looking at Christianity and forming a kind of renewal is actually anthroposophy, so Steiner, like that instead that still connects to the Christian myth, but has found ways into a new form of mysticism, uh, that and touching the reenchantment. One also dimension about actually we spoken about my mother. My mother is actually Asian. She's Taiwanese.
Mm,
And I found that what is very fascinating about my mom's relationship to Christianity and to the Christian myth is that she actually interprets it for a quite Asian Buddhist Taoist lens. Without her maybe realizing, she interprets things in a very circular way. And also because her culture, her continent, did not experience as much of the depth of the level of trauma with Christianity. It hasn't experienced Inquisition. So she can have a quite fresher, less like cleaner relationship to Christianity. And fascinating enough, in the West, we're having mystical renewal, religious renewal into through Buddhism because we haven't experienced maybe the West hasn't experienced the level of maybe corrosion, corruption of Buddhism that in place of Asia has. When I go to Taiwan, you have a lot of young people who actually turn to Christianity because they've seen the calcification of Buddhism in their land. And so there's this kind of like exchange, religious, spiritual exchange that, like in a way, funny enough, I've touched Buddhism through the West, so I've gone into my Asian route through the West, and I'm going to my Western route through Asia, and I'm now maybe entering a kind of full circle moment. But I think sometime indeed the outside eyes can help us rediscover both our limitation but the goodness in our ancient tradition. One
mm,
thing that I found was always amazing about Thich Nhat Hanh was like, don't give up your you don't need to become Buddhist. You are Christian. You have Christian ancestors. Like you, that to not ask us to. You can learn for Buddhism, but you also don't need to kind of sphere, like how do you say, cut yourself, sever yourself from your ancestor lineage. And so I think there's also really something quite important there about the in this kind of like looking forward, how to also reintegrate. I have some intuition that the religion of the future or components of it has to ask us to deal with this kind of a lot of complexity and therefore have this kind of add you can't like you can both surrender but you can't also surrender. You still have to use your own discernment and navigating that. I do sense that there is something quite universal and also of non-violence, because if you truly love all of life, if you truly love all your brother and sister, then yes, like you wouldn't want to kill, like there's some principle, like some sense of that. Then but at the same time, we wouldn't, like it's been a big point for me of like non-violence in
mm,
Buddhism,
mm,
non-killing. Like it's a hard, when you look at it, it implies really the non-self, because if you're w- willing to, if someone, yeah, I think maybe we should have another podcast around non-violence.
yeah.
And like because I think it's a really important one because it touches non-self. And for people who know about Buddhism, that might be something they already know, but for a lot of people, non-self is a bit of a quote unquote mind fuck. How do you apply non-self in like the reality of like right here, right now into the political sphere we are in? How do you apply non-self with climate? How do you apply non-self when there is war? And I will look forward to kind of maybe open that box with you.
Yeah.
Uh, the intricate difficulty of non-self.
Well, the thing is that so another way of saying it is just on that. It's like self, neither self nor non-self, right? That like we either because it's like the if you're anti and the anti of any concept, you're still caught in concepts. And
Yes,
the thing about you know the the truth in that teaching is to not get caught in this concept of yourself.
something and not something.
That's when we're small and we're out of touch with, you could say, God, the thing that's much larger, right? This like the Holy Spirit, right? And in Christianity is this eminence, this thing that we can feel everywhere, this kind of this felt presence of God, right? And if you really feel that, I think naturally one feels neither in the self or not in the self, but
Hmm.
something indescribable.
Well, that's why it's something that is not that you can't approach fully just with mind,
Yeah,
with concept. Well, thank you so much, Liam, for having this beautiful jam with me around this, I think, very important topic into if we are to kind of look into a path to a second renaissance, religion must be in the conversation. And these conversations are very delicate and difficult conversation, and they require us to really put our full-hearted and full mind to it to find a path through that mountain.
mm-mm-mm. Yeah. I mean, last final thought is just because sometimes I feel like people don't, it doesn't quite register. Just look at the rest of the history, right? If we look at like this particular time, it's like, oh, maybe this last
Oh,
100 years
we
wasn't
can't, I
perfect.
can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me
Oh,
now?
yeah,
So I was
that's
saying,
fine.
if you look at the last,
Wait,
last,
I still can't hear you.
uh, well,
Now I can hear. Why is going on? Can you just make your last point? You were saying make your last point about history, and that we'll just edit that.
yeah. So final thought is that, 'cause sometimes the kind of this point of the importance I think doesn't quite completely register for people, and it's useful to think about all the other points in history, right? So if we think that, gee, this last 100 years or of humanity or 150 years of Western civilization isn't maybe as perfect as we thought it was, or as enlightened as we thought it was, uh, I think a lot of people having that realization, well, like, what has the rest of humanity always done? How important has religion been in the lives of everybody else, right? Like, it's sort of like the history of the rest of humanity would point to the idea that a secular culture might be a weird colloquial idea, right? Of a very particular culture, right? And once you have that thought, it's like, oh, right. Well, what do we do about that? I think a lot of people, that's a starting, that's an interesting starting point to just meditate on it. Don't really, I go anywhere with the thought, just consider it.
Mm. Thank you so much, Liam. And keep following us on Over the Mountains. I will interview Liam for many more topics, probably more around modernity, also the equality complex, secularity, Buddhism, economics, and beyond capitalism. Many more subjects to
Climate
come.
crisis, we could do one on that.
Sorry?
Like the climate crisis, we could do that.
And the climate crisis, of course. Uh, there's so many more subjects to explore together. Thank you.
Thanks. Pleasure.